Thanks to Mike and Mike, to everyone at USD, to Don, to Mitch. This is a great event, and I'm just so happy to be able to participate. I'm just going to assume that we've all read the paper, so I'm going to make just a few remarks. So the paper is about the fixation thesis. The fixation thesis is the claim that the communicative content of the constitutional text is fixed at the time each provision is framed and or ratified. So that's the thesis. This thesis plays a role in originalism. As I understand the state of play in contemporary originalist theory, most originalists, but maybe not all, Stephen Sachs may be an exception, are unified by two ideas. One idea is fixation, that is the idea that the meaning in the linguistic sense or the communicative sense is fixed, it doesn't change. And the second idea is constraint, that fixed original meaning constrains the content of legal doctrine and the outcome of constitutional decision-making or constitutional practice. The paper relies on two very basic distinctions in general legal theory. One of those is the distinction between communicative content on the one hand and legal content on the other hand. And so communicative content is the content, right, the payload delivered by the text, communicated by the text. And I'm using the phrase communicative content rather than meaning because the meaning of meaning is itself ambiguous, and so I want to use a phrase that has a history of usage in the philosophy of language and theoretical linguistics and doesn't have a lot of baggage in law. And so the other distinction is the interpretation-construction distinction. I want to be clear that this distinction is technical. There's a long history of usage here. It goes back maybe 1839, but certainly to the early 20th century. Interpretation in this technical sense, and for our purposes it can be stipulated, is the activity by which we discover the communicative content, that is the meaning of the text in the communicative or linguistic sense, and construction is the activity of assigning meaning. So the fixation thesis is a claim about interpretation. It is not a claim about legal content. It is not a claim about construction. Now, originalists who affirm the constraint principle will then think that the fixation thesis has consequences. It means that because we are constrained by the original meaning of the constitutional text and that original meaning is fixed, that certain kinds of constraints are fixed. Although, as Stephen Sachs points out, all of those constraints can be changed depending on your view of the Article 5 enforcement power, maybe not all of them, but the meaning of the original text is fixed and the constraints it provides survive until the text is amended in a way that complies with the text. So that's the nature of the claim. The argument for the claim that's made in the paper begins with the generalized fixation thesis. So this is not a claim about legal texts or in general or the constitutional text in particular. It's a claim about all communications. It's a very simple claim. I illustrated in the paper with the example of a 13th century letter. If you want to know the meaning of any text, you want to know the conventional semantic meanings of the words and phrases, and the regularities of usage that we sometimes call rules of grammar, right? Although they're not exactly really rules, or syntax, right? You want to know, to discover communicative content, you want to know what the words meant at the time. And so, for example, in the 13th century, the word deer referred to all four-legged mammals, and it'd simply be a mistake to assume that it referred to the two related species that we call deer today. Context also contributes meaning. That's pragmatics, right, in philosophical jargon. And the context of a communication is the context at the time, at the time the communication is engaged in. So it's what I think is a fairly simple, highly intuitive thesis, right? Now, who denies this thesis, right? Well, there are a bunch of people who say that the meaning of the Constitution changes, but most of them are actually talking about legal content changing. And because the word meaning is ambiguous, and one sense of meaning with respect to legal texts is in fact a reference to legal content, this apparent denial of the thesis is simply a ship passing in the night. It seems to me that the figure who is most strongly associated with a position that denies the fixation thesis is Ronald Dworkin. He does that in two ways. This paper discusses his dialogue with Scalia, where he sort of accepts certain Scalian premises and then attempts to show via the concept-conception distinction that meaning is not fixed because the Constitution's language frequently employs general concepts of which there can be general conceptions, and the conceptions can change over time. So this paper makes an argument against that version of Dworkin's argument and accuses him of committing a fallacy of the excluded middle. That is, Dworkin says, it's either my theory or you must have the view that meaning cashes out only in terms of original expected applications. And that's just a fallacious argument, right? There is an alternative. The alternative, and this is developed in a different way by Mike Rappaport and John McGinnis in their abstract meaning fallacy paper. The excluded middle is that people communicate, when they use terms that might have both concepts and conceptions involved, use the conception, that is their particular version of the idea. And the paper elaborates this playing off of one of Dworkin's examples. His example has to do with fair bargaining in a real estate transaction and the meaning of fair. And I argue that such communications are best understood as employing a particular conception of fairness, not as referring to the almost empty general concept. So what's the payoff, right? So this is one of these papers that basically tries to convince you that you should just accept the fixation thesis because everything you really want has to do with constraint or determinacy or something else. And so the fixation thesis is something that we should accept and we should move on. Now, not everyone is going to accept that, right? And particularly Dworkin, whose idea of constructive interpretation collapses legal content and communicative content. Dworkin will want to resist this thesis. That's a topic that I dealt with in a separate article that is just about Dworkin's theory of interpretation. I just won't repeat that here for the obvious reason that just the explication of what Dworkin really means part would have taken up the whole paper and my whole 10 minutes. So that's it, and I really look forward to Mitch's comments.